Well, good afternoon. This is the last session. I'm not going to have death by PowerPoint, so I'm not going to have any PowerPoint slides. I'm just going to make some remarks. I do want to say happy Thanksgiving to all of you. I realize it's not a holiday here in Luxembourg, but it's the biggest family holiday in the United States, and we all have much to be thankful for, and we need to remember that every day. Nenad had a story where it referred to a Joe Smith who was from Alabama and who was a big credit risk. Well, for the record, I want you to know that I'm Dave Walker, and I'm from Alabama, and I have an excellent credit score, and I have no personal debt. Unfortunately, that is not the case for governments that I deal with to a great extent. What I'd like to do is to talk to you a little bit about three topics. I'd like to talk to you about financial reporting, about auditing, and about accountability that I think are relevant to this session today, and hopefully they'll provoke some thought, and we'll have some comments after you hear from my two colleagues on the panel. There's absolutely no question that we're facing globalization. There's increased interdependency. There's increased interconnectivity around the world. There are growing gaps between the haves and the have-nots, and in many cases, the so-called middle class are feeling a squeeze from a number of perspectives. There are increasing intergenerational challenges that are also manifesting themselves around the world. These and other factors mean that there's a real need to transform current financial reporting, auditing, and accountability practices around the world. From a financial reporting perspective, there are 3 points that I would make. First, while you need to walk before you run, which means that some countries, especially in the third world, may need to employ cash accounting practices before accrual, we need to adopt accrual on a global basis. And we need international standards, both for accounting and reporting and for auditing. Countries may feel that there is a need for additional disclosures in order to protect their investors or other purposes, but we need to move towards international accounting and reporting and auditing standards, and I advocate for that even in the United States. The fact is that if you don't employ accrual accounting, you can provide a false and misleading view, not just on where you stand financially, but whether or not your policies are sustainable over time. The second point that I would make is, money is important, and it's not just how much you spend, but it's also your tax preferences, it's also your guarantees, it's also a variety of other things that you engage in from a financial standpoint. And while money is important, performance counts too. And the fact of the matter is, without understanding what you achieve with the resources and the authorities that government has, you really don't have a full and fair view about how government is doing. You need to understand what is being achieved with the resources and authorities that are being granted, therefore to be able to assess value for money, which is ultimately what the public cares a great deal about, in addition to trying to combat fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. And when we look at performance, we need to look at least 3 dimensions. How are we doing as compared to plan? Are we getting better or worse over time? And how do we compare to our comparator groups? Whether you're an individual, whether you're a company, whether you're a country, if you don't know those 3 things, you don't really know how well you're doing. And as an example, in the United States, I've advocated to a great extent to do much more benchmarking, because there is a belief on behalf of many of our elected officials that the United States, because we're the largest economy on earth, because we're the temporary sole superpower, and I underline temporary, that the fact of the matter is they assume that we win a medal in virtually everything. And the answer is we're way below average on a number of things that really are important, such as K through 12 education, critical infrastructure, and even debt to GDP in many regards. And so it's important to be able to put things in perspective. Performance counts. And then the third dimension on financial reporting would be sustainability. What is the long-term sustainability of current policies and practices, not just on the revenue side, but on the spending side and other aspects. And the situation got so serious in the United States that as Comptroller General of the United States, I actually modified the audit report on the consolidated financial statements of the U.S. government to place an emphasis paragraph to note that the United States was on an imprudent and unsustainable path, that it needed to make tough choices with regard to tax policy, with regard to social insurance programs, and a variety of other things in order to put itself on a path where debt to GDP could be restored to a reasonable and sustainable level given known demographic trends and rising health care costs. From an auditing standpoint, I think it's important to have a philosophy with regard to auditing, that you want to have a constructive engagement approach, that we're not supposed to be the police persons, that we're here to understand what's working and what's not working, that we have to be able to not only point out what's wrong, but to acknowledge what's right, and to try to be able to put things in context. That's very important, I believe. From a GAO perspective, the agency that I headed for about 10 years, I talked about the fact that we were in 3 lines of business. And I think performance and accountability institutions ought to be in these 3 lines of business. We're in the oversight business, we're in the insight business, and we're in the foresight business. Oversight has to do with typical compliance work and things of that nature. The insight business is what works and what doesn't work. And the foresight business is what are the trends and challenges facing the institutions that you work for, and how can we end up identifying those that cross the different silos of government and governments, and how can we end up helping to identify trends and challenges to try to get our clients to address them before they reach crisis proportions. And in order to do this, you have to do financial audit work, performance audit work, compliance audit work, investigative work, standards work, and studies such as benchmarking, best practices, lessons learned, those types of issues. I've also learned with regard to, in the accountability area, that it's important to have a plan, a strategic plan. Believe it or not, when I came to the GAO in 1998, there was no plan. In fairness, the United States government has existed since 1789. It still has no plan. I know you may not want to rush into anything, but I think it's been long enough. But a GAO had been in existence since 1921. It had no strategic, forward-looking, threat, risk, opportunity-based plan, resource-constrained, outcome-focused plan. We put that in within 15 months. We used that as a basis to fundamentally transform the organization that made it 50 to 100% more productive, 3 times the outcome-based results. Second best place to work in the federal government, 95% positive rating from a client that's fairly difficult and dysfunctional called the United States Congress, and I'll just leave it at that. So you have to have a plan. You need to separate and designate high-risk areas. We have something called a high-risk list. There are areas of government, functions, programs, operations that are higher risk of fraud, waste, abuse, or mismanagement, where we place a disproportion of time and emphasis, and I think that's important for this organization and others as well. Core values, what do you believe in? What are your positive beliefs? What are your institutional boundaries, which can be extremely helpful in making tough choices quickly and consistently. And I use them all the time in saying no to the Speaker of the House about some work that he wanted us to do that I felt were inconsistent with our core values. In addition to that, they are helpful in in doing work and testifying in tough topics like Iraq and other issues. And furthermore, they were necessary when I decided to sue the Vice President of the United States for his failure to provide transparency and accountability in accordance with national energy policy. But more important, they were things that brought us together consistent with professional, objective, fact-based, nonpartisan, evidence-based approaches that the institution needs to be known for. One simple concept but powerful concept for accountability institutions is leading by example and practicing what you preach. If we're the ones that are supposed to be responsible for assessing how others do, we need to be as good or better than they are in every way, including how we operate ourselves, including with our degree of transparency and accountability in order to improve our credibility. I've already mentioned about having a constructive engagement approach, having protocols with regard to how do you deal with your auditees, how do you deal with the press, how do you deal with the public, international standards, having that and applying those in a consistent and credible way, and then obviously the most important asset that we all have is our people, our human capital. We're only as good as our people. Our most important assets walks out the door every night, and we hope that it comes back the next day. So in summary, I think we're in a time of transition that creates challenges, but it also creates opportunities. We need to work together. I think my view is that performance and accountability institutions, such as those that are here, should lead by example. They need to promote transparency, accountability, and transformation. And in many cases, transformation is critical. For your information, in closing, there is a professor of happiness in the Netherlands, and that professor has done research and has found that there is a direct correlation between a strong and credible supreme audit institution and public happiness. At the same point in time, I think it's important to note that correlation is not necessarily causation. Nevertheless, let's work together to help improve trust in governments, to try to help improve performance, to try to ensure accountability, and to try to create a better future for all of our citizens. Thank you.